They opened the gate and froze. What lay before them was not a camp. It was a graveyard that still breathed. 60,000 people starved, dying in heaps. 10,000 bodies rotting in the open. Mothers cradling children too weak to move. Soldiers covered their faces from the stench, but nothing could shield them from the sight. Liberation was supposed to bring hope. Instead, it delivered horror and a demand for justice so urgent, it would lead straight from the barracks to the gallows. Stay with us to see how the nightmare of Belsen forced the world to confront justice in the ruins of war. In the next minutes, you'll see what those troops found inside Bergen Belsen, how a humanitarian rescue became a criminal investigation, why doctors fought disease while officers hunted culprits, and how a wartime courtroom in Lüneburg delivered verdicts that led to executions carried out behind prison walls. You'll also see how a camp that could not be saved was burned to stop an epidemic, how evidence was gathered under pressure, and how the legacy of one trial shaped law, memory, and the way the world continued to speak about justice. To understand how that arc unfolds, from liberation to law, we begin with the ground itself, a camp in northern Germany whose purpose kept shifting until it became a machine of neglect and death. Bergen Belsen sits in Lower Saxony. It started in 1940 as a prisoner of war site that held French and Belgian captives, then Soviet POWs. In April 1943, the SS took control and redefined the place as a full concentration camp. By April 1945, the system inside had broken down. Guards remained, but order was a fiction. The Germans negotiated a handover to prevent typhus spreading into nearby towns. On April 12th, an arrangement was made, and on April 15th, British units entered after being told there were some sick prisoners. What they walked into was far worse. Roughly 60,000 people were inside. Most had been starved to bone and skin. Many could not lift their heads. Many could not stand. Triple-stacked bunks held more than human bodies could bear. Children cried softly or simply stared. Some wore no clothes at all. Their garments had rotted weeks earlier. Everywhere, the dead were present. 10,000 corpses lay scattered across barracks and pathways, slumped by latrines and piled in ditches. Soldiers covered their faces against the stench. Death had occupied every corner. The ground itself testified to collapse. Human waste soaked floors. Lice and fleas moved freely. Rats ran between huts and bodies. Water taps failed. Toilets were unusable. A few barrels of aging soup could not be called food. Disease ruled. Typhus carried by lice, dysentery, tuberculosis, infections that leapt from person to person in overcrowded rooms where hunger had already done its work. 500 to 600 people were dying every day. The infirmary was a wooden shed without medicine, without doctors, and with patients lying on the floor. The troops had trained for combat. They found a public health disaster. Within a day, they set up a command post at the entrance and took control of all operations. Priorities were clear: halt contagion, get survivors immediate aid, and keep those responsible from slipping away in the confusion. Medical detachments arrived from nearby field hospitals. Army doctors and nurses, shocked but disciplined, began organizing treatment zones in huts and tents, moving the worst cases to mobile hospitals, and working in protective gear against the constant risk of infection. Some soldiers were themselves quarantined after only hours inside. While medics stabilized the living, officers moved on the perpetrators. Orders went out to locate anyone who had worked at the camp: SS guards, officers, administrators, doctors, cooks. Every role that kept the machinery running. There were rosters to consult, but many staff tried to pass as inmates. Units searched every block, interviewed survivors, checked documents, and studied uniforms for telltale details. Some SS men swapped clothing with prisoners. Some fled days earlier. Some hid nearby in civilian dress. Within 4 days, more than 80 staff were identified and arrested. Women were among them. Female guards had patrolled the women's compounds, enforced punishment, and assisted with selections. Several had served at other camps, such as Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. A notorious name among the arrested was Irma Grese, only 21 yet already infamous for her cruelty. A reputation noted even by colleagues. She was taken into custody in uniform, without visible remorse. Another was Josef Kramer, the commandant since December 1944, and previously an officer at Auschwitz, known as the Beast of Belsen. He did not resist. He walked officers through buildings and past piles of bodies, with a calm that made everything worse. He too was arrested. Those captured were separated from prisoners and held under guard. Some were questioned at once. Others moved to secure locations for longer interrogations. Survivors, despite exhaustion, identified guards who had beaten or tormented them, naming names, describing scenes. Those testimonies would become the bones of a criminal case. At the same time, British officers compelled many of the arrested SS to do what they had refused to do before: clean the camp. Under armed watch, they hauled corpses onto carts, carried them to trenches, spread lime, and shoveled earth day after day, while the people they had brutalized looked on. By April 20th, the British controlled every aspect of the site. Staff were behind bars. Disinfection had begun. Plans were drawn to relocate survivors to safer quarters as soon as possible. Yet by early May, the truth was unavoidable. The place could not be salvaged. Lice, filth, and waste were everywhere. Quarantines, clean water tanks, and DDT powder could not erase years of negligence compressed into wood and bedding. Floors were soaked with contamination. Mattresses crawled with insects. There was no safe way to reuse any part of the original camp. Military leaders made a final, brutal but necessary decision: destroy the camp entirely. In May 1945, soldiers burned Bergen Belsen to the ground in a controlled operation, hut by hut, to keep fire within the perimeter and disease from traveling beyond it. Sleeping blocks, storage sheds, medical huts, watchtowers, everything went up in flames. The goal was not revenge. It was public health. Kill lice, end contagion, and protect nearby villages and the troops who still worked in the area. Survivors had already been moved to temporary hospitals and shelters with clean beds, real food, and access to medicine. Weak as they were, they finally had a chance to recover. When the last timbers charred and fell, only ashes and blackened posts remained. Mass graves were sealed. Warning signs marked the ground as contaminated. Entry required protective gear for months. With the physical site erased, focus shifted to accountability. The British treated Bergen Belsen not merely as a tragedy, but as a crime scene. Military police and war crimes investigators took charge. From May through August, teams interviewed survivors recovering in hospitals and shelters. Meanwhile, other units collected physical evidence. Before the destruction, photographers and film crews had documented conditions in detail, producing thousands of images and hours of footage. Investigators also searched the camp's paper trail. Despite the chaos, some records had survived. Prisoner lists, transport logs, work rosters, supply accounts, identification papers, and orders belonging to guards and administrators. Each document tied a name to a role, a date, and a place. For the summer, legal teams organized the material, and determined who should be charged and with what counts. By August, a list of 45 defendants had been compiled. 25 men and 20 women from across the camp hierarchy. Many had been arrested in April. Others were tracked down in the following weeks. They were not all high-ranking. The roster included officers, block leaders, functionaries who ran roll calls and labor details, and staff who controlled food distribution and punishment routines. The case would address the system from top to bottom. All 45 were charged under international law for war crimes. The label that, in this context, covered murder, torture, forced starvation, and deliberate neglect of basic human needs. The prosecutors made a deliberate choice. Focus only on what each person did at Bergen Belsen. Some defendants had served at other camps, including Auschwitz or Dachau, but those crimes were beyond the scope of this case. Keeping the trial tied to one place and period would make the mountain of evidence navigable and the verdicts comprehensible. On September 17, 1945, the Belsen trial opened in Lüneburg, a town in northwestern Germany. A modest building had been converted into a military courtroom. It was the first major British-run war crimes trial after the war. The room held judges in uniform, prosecutors and defense counsel, clerks and officers. Journalists from across Europe and America filled benches. Most important, survivors were present, some to watch, some to speak publicly for the first time about what they had endured. 45 defendants sat in a long row. They wore plain clothing. Some looked anxious, others sat blank as if choosing neutrality could erase the past. Proceedings followed British military law. Translation ensured that court and accused could follow every word. One by one, charges were read aloud. Each person heard the counts against them and entered a plea. The prosecution team, preparing for months, presented a case built on documents, photographs, and film captured in the days after liberation. They introduced orders and duty rosters showing who worked where and when. Then came the witnesses. Survivors took the stand. Many spoke quietly. Some paused, pulled back by memory. Some had lost their families in the camp. Others barely survived themselves. The defense offered familiar arguments. We had no choice. We were following orders. We lacked the power to stop what larger authorities had set in motion. The court heard those claims and kept going. After more than 2 months of testimony and evidence, the court adjourned to deliver judgment. On November 17, 1945, verdicts were read. The majority were found guilty of war crimes. 11 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Josef Kramer and Irma Grese, as well as guards who witnesses had seen beating, shooting, or starving prisoners. 19 received prison terms ranging from 10 to 15 years, reflecting roles that were smaller or less directly violent, but still part of a system that killed by policy and neglect. 7 were acquitted for lack of proof that met the standard of the court. The judgment was also clear on principle. Following orders was not a defense for crimes against humanity. Those condemned to die were transferred to Hameln prison in Lower Saxony, a secure facility under British control. They were placed in separate cells, watched around the clock to prevent suicide, cut off from visitors, held in a quiet routine that acknowledged what was coming. Senior legal officers reviewed each case again to ensure process had been correct. Approvals were given for the sentences to proceed. The execution date was set for December 13, 1945. The man selected to carry them out was Albert Pierpoint, among Britain's most experienced executioners. Preparations at Hameln were quiet and exact. The gallows were inspected and tested. Ropes were measured and adjusted to match each person's height and weight so the drop would be swift, in accordance with British standards intended to minimize suffering. Only trained staff and designated military officials were involved. No public announcements were made. The press received no schedule. The aim was order, not theater. Each prisoner was informed privately of the date and could see a chaplain if they wished. Some stayed silent. Some appeared nervous but resigned. There were no reports of panic. On the morning appointed, executions were conducted in sequence. The chamber held only officers, prison staff, legal observers, and the execution team. Each proceeding followed the same steps. A prisoner was led from a cell. Identity was confirmed. A hood was placed. The noose was set. A lever was pulled. Seconds later, it was done. The area was cleared and reset before the next person arrived. As each death was recorded, bodies were prepared for burial in unmarked graves, an intentional choice to prevent future sympathizers from creating sites of homage. There were no ceremonies, and no last words released to the public. With the burials complete, the British closed the case of the Belsen guards. The process that began with liberation had reached its legal end. Survivors continued their recovery in safer places. Medical teams kept working. Investigators archived the records, statements, and images for history and for future law. Within days of the Belsen verdicts, another courtroom opened in Nuremberg on November 20th, 1945, convened by judges from the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. Unlike the Belsen matter, which focused on one camp, Nuremberg pursued the architects of conquest and genocide. Over the years that followed, more tribunals convened, some quickly in the wreckage of war, some decades later when governments changed and archives opened. Nations including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union held trials of former SS members and collaborators. The timeline stretched, but the idea took hold. Crimes at this scale would be named and judged. The legal legacy extended beyond Europe. Concepts refined in these trials helped shape responses to atrocities in places like Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. The principle is stark but vital. War crimes and crimes against humanity must be named and prosecuted, wherever they occur. Memory and law reinforce each other. The moral vocabulary forged in 1945 still matters when the world confronts mass violence in our own time. Today, nothing of the original camp stands. The site is a memorial, a museum, a cemetery, plaques that tell the story. School groups visit. Survivors and their families return to speak. Historians continue to study the trial, to understand how an early attempt at justice worked, what it decided, where it fell short, and what it taught the world about responsibility. We end where we began, with the moment British soldiers realized that liberation was only the beginning. Saving lives required medicine and logistics. Seeking justice required persistence and law. Burning the camp was a public health act, not an erasure. The trials that followed were not perfect and could not heal what had been destroyed, but they made a necessary statement. Suffering will be documented. Perpetrators will be named. And even when sentences are carried out behind walls, the world is meant to understand why. Back inside the camp in those first days, the military effort looked like a hybrid between a field hospital and a disaster relief operation. Water tanks arrived and were rigged to provide clean supply where pipes had failed. Teams set up delousing stations and dusted clothing and bedding with DDT in an attempt to kill lice, which were the engine of typhus. Sections of the camp were cordoned off into zones so the sickest could be isolated. Even with these measures, disease outran medicine. Doctors worked until voices cracked. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Everyone understood that progress would be measured in inches. As survivors stabilized, the British moved people out in stages. Nearby army barracks and emergency shelters were converted into temporary hospitals with clean beds and proper kitchens. There, patients could receive antibiotics when available, broths, and supervised meals that slowly rebuilt strength. Even small improvements, fresh linen, a warm drink, a quiet room, had meaning after the wreckage of the camp. Many remained desperately weak, but at least they had a chance to recover. The plan was simple: stop the dying, then start the formal work of justice. Documentation was exhaustive because it had to be. Photographers recorded the physical reality before flames erased the site. Film crews walked through barracks and along pathways, establishing a record that could not be dismissed as rumor. Medics logged cases. Engineers mapped structures. Investigators collected identification papers, orders, rosters, transport lists, and supply records, anything that connected names to roles and actions. Every scrap of paper was a possible thread tying a person to a place and a responsibility. The choice to focus on Bergen Belsen alone was strategic as well as ethical. Trials bogged down when they try to represent the entire war at once. By limiting charges to one location and a defined period, prosecutors could match statements to documents and photographs with minimal confusion. That approach also meant defendants could not hide behind the complexity of the larger system. Each was judged on conduct inside this camp. Beatings, shootings, selections, the withholding of food, the denial of medical care. The acts that made survival a matter of luck. Inside the courtroom, the rhythm of law replaced the chaos of the camp. A judge called the session to order. Translators rendered questions and answers into languages everyone could understand. Defense counsel cross-examined witnesses and challenged identification. The prosecution responded with rosters and duty logs that placed a named guard in a specific block on a particular date. Film clips were played. Photographs were passed along the bench. The narrative that had once been whispers hardened into a record. Sentencing reflected degrees of responsibility, but did not flinch from the severest penalty where the evidence supported it. Those imprisoned for terms of years still carried the mark of guilt for participating in a system designed to crush human beings. Those sentenced to death were held under conditions that were controlled and sober. There would be no spectacle, no chants in the streets, no crowds at the gallows. Justice, as the British understood it in that moment, was to be exact, swift, and restrained. At Hameln, the quiet was almost a doctrine. Guards spoke in low voices. Steps echoed on corridors scrubbed clean. Each condemned prisoner lived on a timetable. Meals, checks, a chance to see a chaplain. Executioners, contrary to popular myth, did not delight in their task. They trained to remove drama from it. Ropes were coiled and measured. Drop lengths were calculated to ensure a quick end. Forms waited on clipboards. When the morning came, the procedure moved forward without flourish. The point was not to shock. It was to conclude. When word of the executions filtered out, it did so through official notices rather than lurid headlines. Bodies were interred in unmarked graves with records kept by the authorities, not to honor the dead but to prevent any future attempt to turn criminals into symbols. In the weeks that followed, the British moved on to other cases, other files, other names. But the Belsen trial remained an early template, a demonstration that even in the ruins of war, evidence could be gathered, arguments made, verdicts issued, and sentences carried out with restraint. The memory work began immediately as well. Educators used the photographs and films in classrooms. Museums formed plans to curate testimony. Survivors wrote and spoke, sometimes after years of silence, naming the friends they lost and the routines that had kept them alive. The site itself became a place to stand and listen. The absence of buildings matters. It forces visitors to imagine rather than to gawk, to read and reflect rather than to stare. And the law that developed in the wake of these cases did not stay in Europe. Decades later, when mass killings scarred Rwanda, or when ethnic cleansing tore at the former Yugoslavia, prosecutors reached back to the ideas sharpened in 1945. Individual responsibility, command responsibility, crimes against humanity, the infrastructure of tribunals and the mechanics of proof. The world is not consistent in its application of those ideas. But the vocabulary remains, and it owes much to courtrooms like the one in Lüneburg. We close with an uncomfortable truth. The executions at Hameln were never meant to be palatable. They were meant to be lawful. There is nothing to celebrate in a life ended on a rope, even when that life belonged to someone who made murder routine. What matters is that the path to that rope ran through testimony, evidence, and judgment rather than revenge. Bergen Belsen teaches us what happens when institutions choose cruelty. And it also shows what institutions can do when they choose responsibility. Because of both, the world remembers. Stay with us for carefully sourced histories told with respect. Subscribe, and in the next episode we trace how early post-war courts shaped later tribunals, and where justice still struggles to catch up with memory worldwide.